There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over the mall on a gray London morning. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind you'd find in a park or a library. It's more like the city is holding its breath. The buildings lined up on either side, those old stone faces staring down, the flag above the palace not quite moving. That was the for what it's worth quiet on the morning I'm going to tell you about. I wasn't supposed to be there that early. I'm a travel photographer, freelance, and I'd booked a small hotel off Victoria Street 3 nights before a shoot for a tourism magazine. The brief was simple. Capture Buckingham Palace during the changing of the guard, get a few candid crowd shots. Maybe something usable for a double-page spread. Standard stuff. I'd done it twice before. I knew the rhythms of the place. The way tourists start queuing along the railings well before the ceremony, the way the mounted police appear like they materialized from nowhere, the particular creak and clatter of the gates when they're being worked. What I didn't know, not that morning, was that I was about to watch something unfold that I still think about. Something that made me question what I'd always assumed about those men in red tunics and bearskin hats. I think. Ones everyone photographs and pokes at and tries to make laugh. The ones we all look at without actually seeing. It was a Tuesday in early November. Cold. Not brutal cold, not the kind that bites your fingers off, but the damp London cold that gets into your collar and sits there. The sky was the color of old newspaper. I got to the Victoria Memorial just after 9:30, coffee in one hand, camera bag over my shoulder, breath making small clouds. There were already maybe 40 or 50 tourists scattered along the front railings. Families, mostly. A few school groups in high-vis vests. Some Japanese tourists with cameras that cost more than my laptop. A couple of backpackers who looked like they hadn't slept. A woman near me, American by her accent, was trying to explain to her daughter. Couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Why the guards don't move. They're like statues, honey. They practice not moving. The little girl stared at the nearest guard and said, very seriously, "But what if he needs to sneeze?" And I remember thinking, yeah, what if he does? And that's the thing about the guards. We reduce them to props. To be fair, to living statues, to something you photograph and move on from. We don't think about what's happening behind those eyes, behind that absurd hat, inside that red coat. We don't think about what they're trained for, what they're watching for, what they're carrying the weight of every single minute they stand there. I sat, I think, up near the left side of the memorial, good angle, clear sight lines to the main gate. The ceremony was scheduled for 11, but I liked getting there early to watch the crowd. Warm up. There's always better candid material in the waiting than in the event itself. I crouched down and got a few low-angle shots of a toddler with his face pressed between the railings. Beautiful light even with the overcast. Sometimes gray skies are a gift. That's when I first noticed him. Not because he did anything dramatic, not because he moved or shouted or made any sudden gesture. I noticed him because he was the one guard who wasn't doing what the others were doing, which was standing perfectly still in that practiced, almost architectural way they have. He was at his post, yes, which sentry box on the right side of the forecourt, further back from the main gate. Standard position, red tunic, bearskin, rifle. Plus, everything correct. But something in his posture was different. I've photographed these ceremonies enough times to know what correct posture looks like on a guard, and this wasn't quite it. His head was very slightly angled, not turned. That would have been obvious. Just angled, like he was listening for something. Or tracking something at the edge of his peripheral vision without committing to looking directly at it. I lifted my camera and zoomed in on him. Not for any professional reason. Just because the photographer in me noticed something and the camera went up automatically. Through the lens, the detail I couldn't see with the naked eye became clear. His jaw was set, not the loose, neutral expression guards are trained to wear. Set. The kind of tension you put in your jaw when you're holding something back. when you're working very hard not to react to something. His eyes, and this was the part that made me hold very still, were fixed on something to his left. Not at Look, the crowd along the railings, not at the tourists. Somewhere inside the forecourt, something behind like him to his left that I couldn't see from my angle. I lowered the camera. The woman beside me was still talking to her daughter about sneezing. I looked around. 2 uniformed police officers were standing near the main gate in their usual positions. They were talking to each other, not urgently, the kind of easy conversation when you've been posted at the same spot for 3 hours and you're killing time. Nobody else seemed to have noticed anything. I looked back at the guard, which he was still doing it. That fractional angle. That jaw. I've covered enough assignments in enough unusual places to have developed a very basic instinct for when something is wrong. Not crisis wrong, not danger wrong necessarily. Just a shift in the atmosphere, a change in frequency, like the air pressure dropping before rain, which it was dropping now. I started shooting again, and not the crowd. Him. For the next few minutes, nothing changed, and he stood. The crowd milled. A police officer walked a slow arc near the gates. Pigeons landed and relocated on the memorial behind me. The little girl asked her mother why the guards wore such tall hats, and her mother said something about looking intimidating. The little girl said they looked like they were going to a fancy dress party, and a few people around her laughed. The guard's jaw tightened. Just slightly, just enough. And then one of the officers near the gate, the younger one, I'd been watching him peripherally, stopped talking to his colleague. He didn't move yet. But he stopped well, talking, and his posture shifted in that way that bodies shift when something in the environment has changed. Not alarm, attention. And he was looking in the same direction as the guard, into the forecourt, to the left. I moved. Not dramatically, not, pushing through the crowd. I just walked to the far right along the railings, slowly, like someone repositioning for a better photo angle. A few tourists did the same, instinctively following the movement, the way crowds do. But they weren't looking at what I was looking at. From the new angle, I could see further into the forecourt. And that's when I saw the man. He was standing about 30 meters inside the main gate, which shouldn't have been possible because the main gate was closed and wouldn't open until the ceremony. Actually, he wasn't a guardsman. He wasn't in uniform of any kind. He was wearing a dark jacket, carrying something. I couldn't tell what. The angle was wrong. And he was walking with a very specific kind of deliberate calm that immediately felt wrong. TBH. Not running, not rushing. That studied, controlled walk of someone who knows they're somewhere they shouldn't be and is trying very hard to look like they belong. He was heading toward the inner buildings, which the guard I'd been watching, that guard, the one with the jaw and the angle, he hadn't moved. Protocol said he couldn't, not on his own authority, not without clearance. But his eyes were locked on that man like rivets. And then things happened quickly, and not dramatically. Not like the films, no shouting, no sort of running, no sudden chaos that sent the crowd scattering. What happened was quiet and efficient, and I realized later very well practiced. The TBH. That younger officer near the gate spoke into his radio, low, close to his shoulder. 2 words, maybe 3, which a second later, 2 things happened simultaneously. The guard, my guard, the one I'd been watching, moved from his position, and 3 other figures appeared from somewhere inside the forecourt, from positions I hadn't even registered as positions, moving toward the man in the dark jacket with that same controlled calm. The crowd had no idea. The woman with the daughter was now pointing at a pigeon that had landed on the memorial. The school group was being counted by a frantic teacher. Someone near me was holding up a phone to take a selfie with the gate in the background, utterly oblivious to what was happening 30 meters past their own reflection. I was shooting continuously, my camera just running. The man in the dark jacket stopped walking. I think he heard them before he saw them. He turned around, I think, and I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something, because I think it matters. What happened next isn't what you might expect. There was no violence, no takedown, no moment of Hollywood drama. What happened next was stranger than that, and in some ways more unsettling, and it's the part I keep returning to when I think about that morning. The man in the jacket, late 30s, maybe 40, he had a beard and glasses and looked honestly like someone's slightly distracted uncle. When he turned around and found himself faced with 3 people moving toward him, he stopped. And then he sat down. Just sat down. Right there, you know, on the forecourt flagstones. Crossed his legs. Put whatever to be fair. He was carrying a notebook, I could see it now, just a notebook, in his lap. And started crying. Not panicking. Not threatening and not arguing. Just crying. Very quietly. Sitting on the ground of Buckingham Palace forecourt. Crying. While 3 officers stood around him and the ceremony crowd 20 meters away remained entirely unaware. The guard who'd first noticed him, my guard, was standing slightly back from the others, not involved in the approach, just standing, watching. I don't know what possessed me to keep my camera on his face in that moment instead of the man on the ground. Professional instinct, maybe. But I did. And what I saw through that lens I haven't quite stopped thinking about. He wasn't watching the man on the ground with suspicion or relief or professional satisfaction, and he was watching him with something that looked, from where I was standing, very much like recognition. Not personal recognition, not, I know this man. Something else, something older than that. Plus, the recognition of one exhausted person for another. I didn't get access to what happened next. Not directly. The man on the ground was escorted gently through a side entrance, and the whole thing was done in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes. The ceremony began. At 11 as scheduled. The crowd cheered at the right moments. The band played. The horses clattered. Nobody around, I mean. Me knew anything unusual had happened. But I'd my photos. And I'd questions. I'm not a journalist. I want to be clear about that. I'm a photographer. I don't chase stories. I don't knock on doors. I don't cultivate sources at Whitehall. But I'd, for what it's worth, caught something on that camera that I couldn't quite let go of, particularly the face of that guard, that moment of, whatever it was, recognition, wait, which I went back the next day and the day after. Same time, same spot. The 3rd day, after the ceremony, I was packing up near the memorial when a man sat down on the bench beside me. 40s, out of uniform, north of England accent. He bought a coffee from the cart nearby, the kind in a paper cup with a cardboard sleeve. He didn't look at me when he spoke, just looked at the palace. "You were for what it's worth here Tuesday," he said. Not a question, which I said yes. "Saw your camera. You got a lot of shots." He sipped the coffee. "You going to do anything with them?" I told him the truth. I didn't know yet. The ones I was planning to use were crowd shots. Ceremony stuff. I hadn't decided about the others. He nodded slowly. "That man on the ground," he said. "He wasn't dangerous, and I want you to know that. He was a father who'd been trying for 8 months to get a letter to the right people about his son. His son got into trouble overseas, complicated situation, and he'd gone through every official channel he could find and hit walls every time. He'd come to the forecourt because he didn't know where else to go. Wasn't the first time he'd tried. He let that sit there for a moment. The guard who raised the alarm," he continued. "He's the one who flagged the situation 4 days earlier as well, when the same man was spotted in the area. He documented it both times, filed the concern properly. He finally looked at me. That honestly matters more than people think." I asked what he meant. He turned the paper cup slowly in his hands. "There's a version of that situation where the guard sees a figure moving in an area he shouldn't be in, doesn't raise it because it feels ambiguous, because he doesn't want the paperwork, because nothing looks overtly threatening, and actually then something goes wrong, or nothing goes wrong, but the man doesn't get help. Either way, the moment passes, and nobody does anything. He paused. The job is about reading what's obvious, every single shift. I asked him if he was a guard, past or present. He smiled, just slightly. I'm like, someone who cares very much about whether those men and women are given what they need to do it properly. He finished the coffee, stood up, dropped the cup in the bin beside the bench. Enjoy your photos, he said, and walked toward the tube. I kept thinking about what he said, reading what's obvious, because here's the thing about those guards. Here's the thing that I've never heard anyone talk about properly, and I've been in enough rooms with enough people who stand and observe for a living to know this is real. Standing still isn't passive, and we watch those guards and we see immobility, and we translate immobility as ease, as absence of effort, plus as nothing happening. We laugh when tourists wave hands in front of their faces and they don't react. We treat it like a party trick. We post the videos online. Who can make the guard laugh? Who can make the guard blink? Who can make the guard break? We don't ask, what's it like to be the thing that isn't allowed to break? I did some reading after that. Not deep research, just the kind of reading you do when something lodges in your mind and you can't unstick it. For what it's worth, the training, the protocols, the things those guards are expected to hold in their heads while they are also expected to hold their bodies in a rigid stillness that most people couldn't manage for 10 minutes, let alone 2 hours. They're monitoring exits, plus memorizing faces. For what it's worth, tracking movement patterns, processing ambient sound for anything that falls outside the standard frequencies of a crowd, a particular tone of voice, a particular pause, a particular body position. They're doing all of this while the wind is going through the bearskin and the tourists are pointing cameras in their faces. And someone's child is directly under their nose and screaming because they dropped their ice cream. They are doing all of this while looking like they are doing nothing at all. I thought about a conversation I'd once years ago at a press event. I can't remember exactly what the event was now, something to do with a regimental anniversary, one of those things you get invited to when you cover enough royal assignments. I'd ended up talking to a retired sergeant major, a sharp woman in her 60s, who'd served 2 decades before moving into training. I'd asked her the question everyone asks, the cocktail party question. What's the hardest part of the ceremonial role? I expected her to say the standing, or the heat in the tunic, or the tourists. She said, TBH, the decision problem. I must have looked blank. Any given shift, she said, that guard will observe dozens of ambiguous situations. A person loitering too long, a bag left unattended, a vehicle slowing where vehicles don't slow, a sound that doesn't fit. The vast majority of those observations will be nothing. Tourist behavior, which coincidence? Bad parking, and the guard has to make a continuous judgment call about which ones to escalate, knowing that if they escalate too often, they create noise in the system, and if they don't escalate enough, they create gaps. She picked up her drink. That's not a mechanical skill. That's a highly developed human judgment skill, and it is being exercised all day long inside a body that isn't allowed to move and a face that isn't allowed to show it. I thought about the guard's jaw, that fractional angle. I thought about 4 days, 2 documented observations, and the paperwork filed properly. There were consequences, as the story title you gave me suggests, and they kind of weren't the ones I'd initially assumed. I assumed, if I'm honest, that consequences meant disciplinary. The guard had left his post. Even briefly, even for good reason. That's not nothing in a regiment where protocol isn't suggestion, it's architecture. I mean, assumed there'd been a debrief, a review, maybe a dressing down for the optics of a visible movement at a ceremonial post. What I found out, slowly, through a conversation with someone tangentially connected to the regiment, Not a source in the journalistic sense, more an acquaintance of an acquaintance. The way information moves in London was more complicated than that. Yes, there had been a debrief. Yes, and there had been scrutiny of the decision to move from post. But the scrutiny wasn't punitive, it was procedural, which is a different thing, even if it doesn't always feel like one from the inside. The well guard, I never got his name, I want to be clear about that, I never sought it, had filed his concern correctly on the Tuesday, had flagged the same figure from 4 days prior, had used the right channels. Plus, when the situation developed on the morning I was there, his movement had been coordinated, not unilateral. It had happened in response to a radio communication, not on his own initiative. He'd followed the sequence as designed. The review found that, what the review also found, and this is the part that stayed with me, was a gap. Not in what he'd done, but in what the system had done with what he'd told it. The first report, 4 days earlier, had been filed, had been logged, and had then sat in a queue that nobody had prioritized because the man had no record, no prior incidents, nothing that triggered an automatic escalation. It had been waiting for a human eye to reach it when the man came back. The consequence of the guard raising concerns correctly, as it turned out, was a review that exposed a gap in how those concerns were being processed, and that review led to a change in how flagged observations at that specific site were triaged, a change that nobody made an announcement about. Nobody put out a press release, plus nobody gave a speech or a commendation or a public statement, the kind of change that just happens quietly in the machinery of a very old institution that is, despite everything, still capable of looking at itself honestly when the right person holds up the right mirror. I found, I guess, that quietly extraordinary. Plus, not the heroics of it, because there weren't any heroics. The guard stood at his post, noticed something, wrote it down, stood at his post again, noticed the same thing, stood his ground through a debrief and a review with his paperwork intact, and the institution changed a procedure. That's it. That's, the whole story of the consequences, which nobody filmed that part. Nobody posted it. Nobody tried to make him laugh or blink. I've been a photographer long enough to know that the most important pictures are rarely the ones that look the most dramatic. The best picture I got that morning wasn't of the man sitting on the forecourt. It wasn't of the officers moving toward him. It wasn't even of the ceremony, which was objectively spectacular. It was the one I almost didn't take. After the situation was resolved, after the man had been escorted away and the officers had resumed their positions. The crowd was still completely oblivious, watching the horses and the band. After all of that, the guard returned to his sentry box, walked back to his position, stood, basically resumed the stillness. And I was watching him through my lens as he settled back into it, and there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, the kind of thing that happens between one posture and the next, where something passed across his face. Not relief, exactly. Plus, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked from where I was standing. Like a person setting something down. A weight, which a concern. Something they'd been carrying for 4 days, or maybe longer, that had now been resolved one way or another and could be put aside. Just for a second. Just long enough for me to catch it. And then his jaw loosened, his shoulders settled into the correct position, and his face became what it was supposed to be. Neutral, present, watchful, doing the job. Basically, I got the shot. ISO 800 f2.8, the light catching the side of his face just right under the absurd height of the bearskin hat. Well, not a dramatic photograph. Not the kind, basically, of thing you'd put on a magazine cover or print in a newspaper. But one of the most honest things I've ever captured on a camera, I think. A person at work. Really, genuinely at work. And in a way that nobody watching would ever quite understand. The magazine ran 4 of my shots. Standard ceremony coverage, the gates, the band, a nice wide angle of the crowd in the gray morning light, and the toddler with his face pressed through the railings, which was their favorite, which is almost always how it goes. They put it on page 37. The editor called it charming. She wasn't wrong. She never saw the other photographs. I've shown them to maybe 3 people, a colleague, my sister. Plus, and a woman I met at an exhibition in Shoreditch about 6 weeks after the morning I've been describing, an exhibition about institutional architecture, which sounds dry but was actually fascinating. All these images of buildings designed to communicate power through their physical shape. We got talking over a glass of wine in front of a large print of the Foreign Office facade, and she said she was a sociologist who'd spent 5 years studying ceremonial roles in modern democracies, which is either the best or the worst conversation starter imaginable, depending on your tolerance for very specific academic enthusiasm. I showed her the photograph of the guard settling back into stillness. She was, quiet for a long time, which, "What do you see?" I asked her. She said, "I see the precise moment that private experience becomes public role, the exhale before the inhale, plus that's incredibly rare to catch." I've thought about that a lot, the exhale before the inhale. Here's something that surprised me when I started paying closer attention to this world. And by this world, I mean not just the guards, basically, but the whole architecture of the Royal Protection Detail. The layers of it, the visible and the invisible, the ceremonial and the operational. We think of it as static, as tradition-shaped, as something that belongs to a different century and is being maintained now largely for tourism. Television and basically national identity, preserved like a museum piece, like something behind glass. And there's truth in that, obviously. The bearskins and the tunics and the drill, none of that is primarily functional. It's symbolic, which it's the architecture of continuity that very old nations build around themselves to communicate something about permanence and history. But underneath the glass, the thing that is actually happening, the situational awareness, to the threat assessment, the decision-making, that isn't museum work, that is live and current and constantly adapting. The ceremonies are the same. What's inside them isn't. The man I spoke to on the bench said something about this, actually, though I didn't realize it at the time. Whether those men and women are given what they need to do it properly? I thought he was talking about training, equipment, support systems. Maybe he was. But I think now he was also talking about something harder to quantify. Whether they were given the institutional trust to use their judgment. Whether, when they said, "I have seen something that concerns me," the machinery around them took that seriously. Because here's the thing about raising a concern inside a very formal, very hierarchical institution. It costs something. Not always. Not catastrophically, but there's always a friction. You're generating paperwork. You're creating a record that could be revisited. You're asserting, implicitly, that your observation is valid, that your reading of a situation is worth acting on, and in a world where those around you may have seen the same thing and said nothing, that assertion is a small act of exposure. Every time. The guard filed his concern, twice. The first time, it sat in a queue. The second time, the situation developed fast enough that it couldn't be ignored. But if it hadn't, if the man in the dark jacket had simply walked away that Tuesday morning, if nothing visible had happened, the concern would have sat in that queue a bit longer and eventually maybe been reviewed by someone who logged it as nothing and moved on. And the guard would have known that. He'd have known he raised it and it went nowhere. And the next time he saw something that sat in that same ambiguous space, not obvious danger, not clear threat, just a thing that his developed, practiced, well-trained instinct said wasn't right, he'd have to decide again whether the raising was worth it. That's the consequence I keep thinking about. Plus, pretty much, not the review, not the procedural change, though those matter. The consequence that lives in the space between one observation and the next. The question every person in that role is asking, quietly, on every shift. Do I say something? Which I went back to the mall one more time before the job finished. Early morning, before the tourists, before the coffee carts, just to stand there for a bit. I don't know entirely why. And some stories do that to you, and they pull you back to the place where they happened, as if you left something there. It was cold, colder than the TBH first time. The memorial look was very white in the early light, Victoria on her throne up top with. That expression she always has, not quite stern, not quite regal, something harder to name. Around her sort of base, the allegorical figures in their carved stone robes, as permanent-looking as anything in London. The Well forecourt was quiet and no tourists yet. One officer at the gate, and basically further in, at the sentry box on the right side of the forecourt, a guard at his post. I don't know if it was the same guard. I genuinely don't. The uniform makes it impossible to tell at distance, which I suspect is partly the point. The uniform says, this is the role, not the person. The institution is the constant, which the individual is passing through it. But I looked at him for a while, standing there in the early gray light, still, watchful, the bearskin hat making him taller than he was, the scarlet tunic bright against the pale stone behind him. All those tourists would arrive in a few hours and point their cameras and try to make him smile. They'd post the videos. They'd laugh about the hat. Plus, they'd ask their children to wave at him and be delighted when he didn't wave back. They'd take their pictures of this immovable symbol of something old and enduring, and then they'd go off to the gift shop or to Westminster or to lunch, and they'd carry with them a story of the experience. We saw the palace. We saw the guards. It was brilliant. And in that story, he'd be scenery, backdrop, color. One detail in their larger day. And he'd go on standing there, watching, processing, reading what's obvious, deciding over and over what's worth saying. I thought about the photograph I'd taken. The pretty much exhale before the inhale, and that fraction of a second between the thing he'd been carrying and the returning of himself to the role. I thought about the father with the notebook sitting on the flagstones, crying. I thought about how much of what matters in a given day is invisible, how much of what keeps things intact is happening just below the surface of what anyone is looking at. There's a question that keeps coming back to me. I've been trying to find the right way to end this, and I keep arriving at the same question, which is maybe the only ending theirs. What does it mean to hold something difficult, correctly, like in public, without ever being allowed to show it? The pretty much guard did his job that morning. He noticed something, documented it, raised it through the right channels, stood firm through a review, and the institution he was part of adjusted itself, quietly, in a way that no one will ever see, or report, or celebrate. He actually went back to his post, resumed the stillness, and the day went on. That's not a small thing, even though I guess it looks exactly like one. There's a version of that morning where he sees the figure and says nothing because the ambiguity is too much, because the first report went nowhere, because it's not explicitly his call. In that version, nobody's hurt. Probably. The man with the notebook was no danger to anyone, we know that now. But the gap in the system stays open. And the concern that needed to be voiced stays unvoiced. And the next concern, and the next one after that, accumulates in the weight of all the times that speaking up seemed like more trouble than it was worth. We basically spend a lot of time, I think, celebrating the dramatic moments of courage, the visible ones, the ones that make the highlight reel, the ones that end up on the news, the ones that are unambiguous and photogenic and easy to narrate. We like those stories because they're clean, because the courage is obvious, because everyone agrees afterwards that the right thing happened. We spend, honestly, much less time on the other kind. The kind that happens in a sentry box on a gray November morning when no one is watching except a photographer who almost missed it. Are the kind that involves paperwork and protocol and standing your ground through a review when you might have simply kept your head down. The kind that doesn't resolve into anything spectacular, just a quiet, procedural correction in a very old institution, and a father who eventually, through a completely different and very slow process, got the help his son needed. No parade for that. No honestly, front page, and no ceremony. Just a guard, back at his post, standing in the early light, watching, still. And that, I think, is the part of the picture we never quite managed to photograph. The morning I left London, I passed the mall one last time from the taxi window. The ceremony was in full swing. I could hear the band from the road, that particular brass-heavy sound that carries in cold air. Tourists lined the railings, phones raised. The whole familiar scene. I didn't stop. The shot I needed, I already had. Sometimes the most important frame is the one you almost didn't take.